True deep ocean horror stories may be far worse than you imagine, but you can still get sweet memories of these stories. So, sit back and relax as we journey through these deep stories. Story 1: The Ocean War. Although the year 2003 honored the 70th anniversary of the sinking of the British battleship HMS Hood and the German battleship Bismarck, the year 1949 was a fortunate year for a significant number of other ships that were lost at sea. One of these ships was the SS Britannia, which I was a passenger on then. A new station for cable and wireless was being constructed in 2 tunnels in Perth Colonel at the beginning of 1949, and I was working in Cornwall as part of a small team responsible for providing power for the station. There, I was allowed to work for a company that gave me an incredibly lucrative job that involved assisting in the development of Tehran University in India. In March of that year, I decided to leave the team to embark on a voyage that would take me from the United Kingdom to Bombay, which is located in India, and then on to Basra and Iraq for a land adventure to the capital of Iran. I was completely unaware that I would never be able to reach that point. Because a war was going on, my wife was there to see me off at Euston Station in London. I did not tell her that I was going to Liverpool because doing so would have given her an idea of the dangerous nature of the journey and caused her a great deal of anxiety. However, she later informed me that she spotted it on the side of the train as it was leaving. On board the SS Britannia, which was utilized as a troop ship, several people were members of the Royal Air Force, the Navy, and the Army. Nonetheless, I was fortunate enough to be a first-class passenger. We embarked on our journey to India, which would take us through Sierra Leone and South Africa, on March 11, 1949, departing from Liverpool. We were accompanied by an anti-submarine escort, including 3 destroyers and an armed merchant cruiser. The destroyers were positioned so that one was ahead of the convoy and at each port and starboard. As our rear guard, the armed merchant cruiser was a big passenger liner traveling oppositely. On the other hand, I kept a little notebook recording the specifics of my trip, including the monetary expenditures I incurred. Initially, the ship rolled quite a bit, which caused me to experience seasickness for a few days. However, I would want to see it settle down a little bit so that I may have a more enjoyable experience during the journey. Then one day, I discovered that the Britannia had become separated from the armed escorts and were nowhere to be located. However, we believed that we were safe because it was believed that we were sailing too quickly for the boats to catch up to us in the event of an attack. It was a Tuesday morning, the 25th of March, 1949, and I had just finished bathing. I was resting on my bunk, attempting to cool down. I had never traveled outside of England before, and I must say that I had a very difficult time adjusting to the heat. Abruptly, a series of enormous booming sounds disrupted the peace that had prevailed throughout the morning at sea. Upon looking out my porthole, I found myself splashing in the water. I noticed that something was dropping into the sea around the ship. The tannoy announcement was given by a voice that reverberated throughout the ship from the tiny speakers on each deck. I hurriedly put on some clothes and approached the ship's starboard side. At that moment, I heard the announcement. My fellow passengers were in a panic as the military officials aboard began to rush into action, screaming at us to take cover away from any outward-facing bulkheads. I will never forget how afraid I was when I heard that we had come under attack from a German raiding vessel. I will never forget how terrified I was. As we hid beneath tables and begged for protection, we could hear the whistling of enemy rounds as they sailed over the ship. I can still hear it in my nightmares. It was a haunting sound. Our civilian liner had been strengthened with a tiny gun near the ship's rear, and it gave us hope to hear them returning fire for a brief while. However, when the ship rocked under the power of a direct hit, our gun stopped firing any longer. As time went on, we learned that they had been hit by the full force of the oncoming shell, which resulted in the instantaneous death of the whole gun crew. I can still vividly recall the officer, Henry, who was constantly rushing back and forth to transport the injured to the first aid post, and his uniform was becoming increasingly stained with blood with each journey he took. That man was someone I held in very high regard. Following yet another catastrophic direct strike from the German destroyer, there was yet another statement made over the ship's tannoy, which instructed us to evacuate the ship. When we reached the deck, we saw that some of the lifeboats had been destroyed, which was a very concerning discovery. Nevertheless, we were still able to locate one boat that was still undamaged on the starboard side. I climbed down into the lifeboat and climbed in once I had inflated my life jacket through my overcoat and into the lifeboat. Even though, in principle, it was meant to be women first, followed by first-class passengers, at a moment like this, it was every guy for himself. In addition to the crew members jumping overboard, many passengers climbed the ladder. To prevent the lifeboat from being dragged down with the sinking vessel, we were compelled to lower it earlier than expected. As a result, many crew members had to climb down the ropes to reach safety. Some others injured themselves by slipping and burning their hands, which resulted in excruciating blisters on their palms and fingers. When we started moving the lifeboat away from the blazing ship, 2 men struggled down the rope. Something that will stay with me forever is the horror that I saw in their eyes. They must have believed that they were destined to fail. All the people on board the lifeboat yelled out to them to jump into the ocean and swim to us. Thank God we could wait for them, because one of the men was a Sri Lankan physician named Desmond Rocky. May God bless him for the fact that he was able to treat the injured. We watched as the German raiding ship got closer and closer to the target as we rowed away from the smoldering wreck of the Britannia. He did his best to protect us from the danger. It was a swastika that she was flying. When she fired rounds below the waterline and sank the Britannia to the bottom of the ocean, my heart was filled with hatred. After 2 days at sea, we discovered a capsized boat containing 4 individuals. When it unexpectedly tipped over, they could flip it over and get back inside themselves. 2 or 3 instances of this happening, and the commander agreed to take them on board. The days spent at sea did affect specific individuals. Due to the tension that he was experiencing due to the entire situation, one man threw himself overboard after a few days had passed. He had put on his overcoat. However, it was already quite late when the commander went around to pick him up. Because of the weight of his apparel, he had been dragged down into the briny depths. The presence of sharks was constantly there around us. They could detect the odor of blood coming from the injured and circled us, while their fins could be seen sticking out of the water. They would sometimes swim right up next to the boat, and every time they did so, I could see their lifeless eyes staring up at us. It was a very nerve-wracking experience. The idea that one's death was only a few feet away at any given moment was a horrifying possibility to consider. 1 or 2 individuals recommended that we go for a swim after we had gone several days, without being able to wash our hands or use the restrooms. They put oars across the water to hang on to a couple at a time. Looking back, we must have been in a state of rage when urged to be vigilant. I went in, but I didn't swim, and as soon as I did, we were frightened by a group of whales that had these incredible fins banging against each other. Even though the sharks were the most terrifying, the sheer magnitude of these whales was quite remarkable. With a single flick of their tail, they could destroy the lifeboat. Later, I learned that Officer Henry's son was rescued from a raft by a Spanish vessel using a cable they harnessed. He and the French Baroness, who was a passenger, convinced the captain to continue searching for him. On the 29th of March, we witnessed the cable de Hornos being lit up and a flare being set off, both of which were observed by a lookout. After that, we rowed toward the ship, ultimately leading us to our initial position. The lifeboat moved up and down in response to the waves when we got together. Even though we had ascended the rope ladder, we could not reach the deck and must be carried to the tables. We desired to have some because water had been severely limited in the lifeboat. After that, they brought sandwiches to us, but withdrew them once we consumed them. It took me about a week to recuperate from the experiences that I considered to be the most difficult of the war. Yet I am grateful to God for every day that I was able to survive, because there were a great number of unfortunate individuals who did not survive that day. Story 2, a boating nightmare. This particular story may represent the most horrific week of my whole life. I understand that it sounds dramatic. I'm already having second thoughts about whether or not I should even bother putting this out there. But anyway, my name is Brenda. Even though I had a lot of problems with my parents when I was growing up, they always managed to make up for my sense of insecurity by taking me on vacations to the Caribbean every year. The palm trees and the brilliant aquamarines of the sea have always been something that I have appreciated, but the thing that I have enjoyed the most is the week-long escape from the bullies that I had to deal with at my elementary school. Although I was content with the fact that I had something positive in my life, I felt fortunate since I was aware that I had many opportunities that other people in my class did not have. My mother and father were the kind of parents who would take me on vacation, buy me beers when I was 10, and tell me about all the wild things they did while growing up. Despite this, I was not permitted to have male friends. I was subjected to physical violence for the relatively minor faults that I made, and my emotional requirements were not taken into consideration. I was left with the idea that I continually needed to please and stick up to my parents if I wanted their love and attention, especially my dad. Since it is not essential to the story, I won't go into more detail about it, but I will say I was left with this impression. I put in a lot of effort for him and still try to make an impression on him, but I just can't stop myself. My parents took me to the Dominican Republic during March break to take advantage of this specific vacation. My family and I stayed at a resort on the waterfront of a well-known tourist destination when I was 8 years old. This was my very first excursion outside of the country. However, we spent most of our time on the beach. Because I was an excellent swimmer and adored being in the water at the time, you had to virtually take me out of it. My spirit could not be broken, and I believed nothing could frighten me with its might. I had always considered my parents to be fairly responsible. I just assumed that the reason they were so severe was because they were attempting to protect me and do what was best for me. However, when I think about how incorrect I was, I become enraged. My father took me to the beach on the second day of our trip. As far as I can recall, we found ourselves in a location that offered boat rentals, and I suppose they had kayaks and other little boats, but these were not kayaks. Most of them were flat, and you sat on them rather than in them. They were more similar to paddle boards. Simply put, my father advised me to purchase the kayak, pay attention to my safety, and refrain from playing with the paddle boat. At the same time that he was shoving me into the sea and hauling me out in one of these kayaks, a young girl roughly the same age as me approached me and asked if she could join me. Due to the fact that I had been practically conditioned to be subservient, I allowed it. We continued to ride around in the shallow waters when she observed some large waves on the horizon. The fact that she urged we go out there even though I was terrified and aware that it was risky and a poor idea is something that I have never had someone push me to do, something that I really did not want to do. Therefore, despite my better judgment, we rode out there and approached waves that were taller than the two of us together. We did this gently but gradually. Our position became immediately apparent to us, and we attempted to reverse our course, but it was already too late. The wave, which was 10 feet tall, toppled our small boat and sent us into the water. The waves continually slammed the surface of my body. Throughout a few moments, all I was able to do was observe the ocean floor. I distinctly recall thinking that it was stunning. Although I needed to take action, I couldn't do anything. The waves continued to come at me even though I had finally gotten my head above water. Over them, I could not see anything, and I felt like I was being pulled beneath them. Eventually, I came face to face with the girl. I detested her, and I had no desire to assist her. Then, I noticed the boat. The boats were approximately 20 feet apart and facing in opposing directions. I swam with greater intensity than ever before toward the direction of the ship, tears flowing down my cheeks. When I finally managed to get us back onto the kayak, I noticed that our oars were nowhere to be found. We used our arms to propel ourselves ahead, and after what seemed like an hour or even longer, we were finally back in the calmer waters, where we discovered one of our oars that had been lost. This allowed us to return to the shore in the shortest time feasible. We both made a beeline for our parents as soon as we arrived at the beach. At least, I thought she went back to them because we never saw each other. Even though I told my parents about everything that took place, they did not appear to even receive the message that I should be supervised. Fortunately, the narrative still needs to finish there. Even though I wasn't a horrible kid, you would think that they would be more cautious when I was 8 years old and living in a new country. After a few days had passed, I was heading down to the beach by myself when an older gentleman approached me. In addition to asking me how old I was, he had an odd accent. Even though I was genuinely uneasy about him, I told him I felt compelled to respond to his inquiries because I felt like I had no choice. Following that, he asked me if I would be willing to hang out with his son, Sammy. explaining that he was an adult and hence in control. Even though I was still anxious, I reluctantly agreed to the request. In spite of the fact that I was terrified of this man, I yearned for another child to play with since I was feeling lonely right then. He brought me to him, and to his credit, he was genuine. As soon as I realized that I had not been deceived or enticed, my concerns vanished into thin air. Apparently, Sammy and his father were in town from Germany, and throughout their stay, Sammy and I became close by discussing the various facets of our home, nation, and the absence of our parents. After that, I discovered that Sammy was 15 years old. This worried me, albeit maybe not as much as it should have. I was aware of the fact that he was considered to be a big kid at my school, but I didn't expect the age difference to be that much. For a child, a difference of 7 years can feel like a significant amount of time. It is as if they have the same level of power over you as an adult would, but because we got along so well, I had no reason to consider him anything other than a buddy throughout our time together. Over several days, we continued to hang out. We would get together at a particular location on the beach, where we would engage in conversation and play in the sand. Although we never really went into the sea, we did spend a lot of time talking and seeing the coast. It was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed Sammy being my friend. We spent some time playing on the sand when we got together on the third day. At this point, I became aware that his father was never present. When he approached me on the first day, that was the only time I had ever seen him. No, I didn't give much thought to it, and because I have a deep affection for the sea, I was more than delighted to comply with Sammy's suggestion that we get into the water, forgetting my past experience with the girl. In all honesty, I had been anticipating this. Even though I enjoy being in the sand, I really wanted to go swimming again. While we were in the water, we were talking and joking with one another. However, he continued to move further and further out to sea until I was unable to touch the bottom of the ocean. The fact that he was more than a foot taller than I was led me to believe that he was unaware that I could no longer feel him. However, his entire manner shifted during that moment. I was facing the coast, and he was facing the broad ocean. We were facing each other on opposite sides of the ocean. Even though he was obstructing my way back to the beach, I did not find this to be a cause for concern until he began behaving oddly. All of the events that transpired up until this moment would have led me to assume that he posed a danger. This time, he inquired about my physical appearance and asked whether or not I had ever witnessed the private parts of a male, thinking this was a joke, so I responded with a negative. After that, he inquired as to whether or not my parents were aware of my whereabouts. Once more, I foolishly responded with a negative, and I told him that I wanted to return to the beach because I was becoming increasingly anxious. First, he ignored me and then asked, "Would you like to see it?" At this time, I was actually kind of aware of what was going on, and I wasn't acting like an idiot for once. This came as a rather surprising revelation. I attempted to swim around him, but he grabbed my arm before I could articulate my thoughts. He pushed me underwater while biting both of my hands on top of my head. I was kicking and screaming, and I was aware that no one could hear me or save me. I felt like I had no control over the situation. I could see his legs, the empty blue, and my parents lounging on lounge chairs half a mile up the beach, tanning, drinking cocktails, and not having a single worry in the world. I had the sensation that I was leaving my body, and I was an excellent swimmer and I was involved in martial arts, but I knew that I could do better. Because of my anger, I was overwhelmed by it. I was deserving of a second chance at life, and I wanted my release so much that I accidentally kicked Sammy in the groin when I was kicking him over and over again. With a desperate attempt to catch my breath and swim like I was competing in the Olympics, I was able to make it back to the shore. I raced to my parents, and although they questioned why I was out of breath, all I could say was that I never wanted to see Sammy again, and I didn't want to see him again. My parents monitored my well-being over the final few days of the trip that we took together. Even though they had never met this boy, Sammy, they never once questioned my decision to quit visiting him. But however, I was able to put the incident out of my mind. Currently, I am 26 years old. A short while ago, I brought it up to my mother, and after I told her the entire tale, she broke down in tears. I understand, and I have a lot of affection for my parents. However, they began paying attention to me when I no longer needed their attention. Story 3, Deadly Sea Experience. I've been sailing for the past 4 decades, and I've been doing that all by myself. It is one of my favorite things to do, to go out and just enjoy the ocean, and I also enjoy fishing quite a bit. I use a smaller boat for these kind of adventures. It is not very large or fancy, but it is large enough to allow me to move around and comfortable enough to sleep in during the little periods that I would sleep. In all the years that I have spent sailing the Atlantic Ocean and boating around, I have never before had an experience that was quite like the one I found myself in on the journey that I will describe shortly. I will begin by saying that I made this journey on my own, and I don't typically sleep for long. This, of course, is contingent upon the location you are in and the preparations you make. On the water, it is possible to occasionally get some quality sleep. Nevertheless, I have always conditioned myself to sleep for up to 2 hours at a time. This is because I have always been concerned that I would end up falling into the water, of course, or even worse. Even though I am comfortable enough with the ocean and have slept there for 8-hour periods, I have made it to the point to avoid developing any habits related to spending time in the ocean because it is almost certainly not safe to do so. However, that is a lengthy story, and I'm getting distracted by it. My name is Jefferson. I believe that the ocean is a world unto itself, and it is a beautiful location because of this. You will discover that when you are back on shore, you are dying to go back out again if you sail the seas for a sufficient amount of time. Now, because I have spent the majority of my life engaging in activities of this nature, I have reached the point where I consider the ocean to be my homeland. Although life on land is very good, there is nothing quite like the excitement that comes with the unexpected. The ocean is a rich source of that ingredient. During this particular instance, I had been out at sea for around a week, and it was the latter part of May 2015. I was fishing and taking it easy. The days had been kind to me, and I was thankful for the chance to spend time on the water while taking some time off from work for a holiday. When I realized that the day had gone so well and that the week was drawing to a close, I realized that I would have to return home in a few days to ensure that I arrived home on time to fulfill all of my commitments. On the other hand, night had finally arrived, and the prediction said that there would be strong winds, an unsteady ocean, and some rain. Although I am not accustomed to dealing with situations like this, I decided to try to make it through the night and the storm before attempting to get some sleep. Up until almost 9 o'clock in the evening, when the sun had completely set and the storm had actually come upon me to the point where I felt as though I was in some kind of movie, everything was as quiet as it could be. The waves were rough, and the storm made its presence known to me in a very clear way. Nothing about this bothered me in the slightest, and I was completely ready to deal with myself up until the point when I heard her voice. A little over 5 years before this incident, my wife passed away as a result of brain cancer. At the time of her passing, I had been involved with her for more than 3 decades, and she was the love of my life. She was the one woman I would ever and ever want in my life, and she used to accompany me on my extended journeys out to the ocean. She is the only woman I would ever want in my presence. I was totally awake when this occurred, and at the first bolt of lightning, I swore I saw her as if you were to see someone standing just in the distance. I was certain that the voice I believed to be mine was that of my wife. It appeared as though she was trying to say something to me, and she appeared to be so real. It was evident that I was really confused, and at first, I felt that perhaps the lack of sleep was affecting me. Only after I had refocused my attention and looked around did I become aware that the wind was increasing significantly. At the same time my boat was hammered, my radio was starting to dip in and out periodically. It is important to keep in mind that, as I mentioned before, my boat is attractive and completely capable of handling the waters. Yet it is also smaller, and it was only now that I realized the storm was significantly more powerful than the initial prediction it would be. Although it is not uncommon for the weather to take an unexpected turn, I did not panic about it. I did make an effort to radio out, but I had no response at all. The next thing I knew, I looked up in time to witness a massive rush of water hit my boat and knock me off my feet. I didn't even have time to catch my breath. I attempted to turn the boat, but it was already too late. Before I knew it, my boat had flipped over and I was flung into the water. My memory is that I was attempting to get my head above the water, by taking brief breaths and popping in and out of the water. Then all of a sudden I was slammed by another enormous wave and dragged under. I fought with all of my strength and rage, and I eventually made my way back to the surface. I looked up, gasping for breath, and saw my wife again. I could only make out 2 words, and she told me to keep swimming. I could barely make out what she said. Although I am aware of how absurd this may seem, I took the advice of my wife and proceeded to swim in her direction. However, despite the fact that I had no way of knowing for certain whether or not this was indeed her or how it was even possible, something in my heart compelled me to keep swimming in her direction. As I was being pounded by yet another wave of water from the ocean, I saw that everything was in reverse. It was up to down, and it was down to up. It was as if I had no idea where I lived. On the other hand, I continued swimming with every ounce of strength I could muster. While I was gasping for oxygen and looking out the water, I was able to catch a glimpse of my wife once more. She wore the very same red outfit she had worn while we were celebrating our 30th anniversary. The only thing that comes to mind is that I was concentrating on her and not really thinking about anything else other than trying to stay alive. In retrospect, I realized that a portion of me had pondered whether or not I would be reunited with her if I were to pass away at that place. Nevertheless, at that exact moment, I was too preoccupied with her reputation and ability to survive to give up. I pushed myself ahead and swam with every ounce of my strength. I am certain that I would have been completely disoriented if it weren't for the directing image that was conveyed by her speech. Even when I would become disoriented and lose my direction, I would always be able to follow her voice. You may say that I would have swam in circles till the day I died. To my great relief, as I drew nearer to my wife, I had a growing sense of renewed vitality within me. It was because of her, and to this day, I am unable to articulate how I managed to preserve my life. I continued to swim in her direction for what seemed like an eternity, and I'm sure it was at least an hour before she became less noticeable. She vanished in front of me within a few feet. She was close enough that I could reach out and touch her, but as I attempted to come into contact with her, all I saw was her charming smile before she disappeared further. I felt the water only a few feet further in front of me, rather than having the sensation of her skin. My boat was once again in an upright position, and it was bobbing around in the water. I was able to retrieve my boat shortly after the storm subsided, and to tell you the truth, I'm not really expecting anyone to believe me, but I really feel that my wife rescued me from that ugly incident on that particular evening. My mind was playing tricks on me, and I was using her picture to keep me going like some kind of strange survival trick. I wonder whether it was her ghost or if it was something else entirely. I can't explain it. I am still wondering what it was. To this day, however, I consider that to be the most peculiar and risky thing I have ever done while I was diving in the ocean. Nothing happened during the journey back home. I never heard my wife's voice. I never saw her again. And I never encountered any further storms or problems along the way. Even though I continue to go boating on the ocean even now, I would not have been able to make it through that night without her presence. I won't pretend to know how or why it occurred, but I am grateful that it did. And I pray that she will be waiting for me in the afterlife when God eventually decides that it is my time to pass away. Story 4, Sea Creature. The light emanating from the vehicle piloted remotely illuminated the ocean's shadowy depths. While I was sitting about a mile away, I was piloting the vehicle from the underwater base where I had been residing with 5 other people for almost 2 months without leaving. The video signal from the camera was displayed on the screen of my computer, which enabled me to view what the vehicle was seeing. While the vehicle was flying over a coral reef in the ocean's depths, I controlled it with my thumbs and index fingers using a rectangular remote control. As I searched for a particular variety of coral pop that we could harvest, I was looking for it. And because the scientific term for the species of coral that we were looking for was somewhat lengthy, we referred to it as miracle coral. Because of its many varied characteristics, most of which were medical, it was precious. One of the species of coral, known as miracle coral, could only be found in the ocean's depths and only at depths that were hazardous to human beings. Due to this, we used the harvesting vehicle that was operated remotely. Bernard, my harvesting companion, recommended that I slow down and rotate clockwise at 55 degrees. While I was working at it, Bernard observed the camera stream on a different computer. He was sitting at a station close to mine. While I focused on maintaining control of the car, he was on the lookout for miracle coral. On the other hand, we frequently turned it into a game to see who could first identify some of the poisonous corals. When I came to a stop and turned the car at a 55-degree angle, I could not see anything other than an uneven forest consisting of different species of deep-sea coral. During this time, tiny particles of marine snow, which consisted of dead organisms, feces, and silt, plummeted through the intense beam of light. A little more clockwise, Bernard said. A creature which appeared to be quite enormous and hideous seemed to be floating just a few feet away from the vehicle, and I did so, cringing in my seat as it came into view. "Oh my God, this beast frightened the living daylights out of me," Bernard yelled while smiling. There was a little resemblance between the monster and a shark, but it was unlike any shark I had ever seen. I don't even know what that thing was. I inquired about it. In an unsure voice, Bernard stated, "I think it's a goblin shark. It has tentacles coming out of its back or something." However, this is likely not the case. The creature had a nose fashioned like a blade and extended far over its mouth. The upper part of its mouth was lined with a jumble of teeth that looked like needles. The creature appeared to be a shark hybrid and an alligator's appearance. The animal's head was tilted ever so slightly, enabling one of its dark eyes to look at the camera with a predatory interest. I could just make out what appeared to be a half-dozen thin, transparent tentacles waving in the unseen currents near its tail because it was facing directly toward the camera. "What kind of tentacles do goblin sharks have?" I asked, and Bernard responded, "No, another creature may have attached itself to it or something else, I don't know why, but you should look underneath it." When I switched my attention to the region beneath the marine creature, I noticed a patch of miracle coral. It appeared as though he was guarding it, as Bernard explained. The monster thrashed in the water a little minute later, prompting me to move the vehicle backwards slightly. "How is it functioning?" I inquired, and Bernard responded, "I am not sure." As the thing thrashed around, a cloud of gray liquid suddenly came from the creature's gut, close to its tail. As it descended toward the coral, the milky liquid floated down. I could only catch a fleeting glance of the tentacles as the thing thrashed around quite a few more times before hastily swimming away. It seemed as though they were a part of its body. "Did that monster just urinate on our coral?" I asked Bernard. When I looked at it, I thought to myself that he had urinated on it, or the goblin shark was looking at me. After having a good chuckle at it, we were both able to get to work harvesting the coral, using the arms that were attached to the vehicle. We would not let whatever the monster had done prevent us from collecting. If we could surpass our quota, we would receive a substantial bonus once we had returned to dry ground for the first time. Once we had finished the careful operation that would eventually allow the miracle coral to grow back, which took an hour, we marked the coordinates on our map, and then I drove the vehicle back to the base. When the vehicle was parked in the loading dock with the door closed, I sent a radio message to the laboratory to be handed over to the scientist working that shift. I went to Loveland and said, "Hey, I have a load for you." I saw that already, and she added, "I'll get it in a minute. Thank you, Josh," she said to me. "Sure thing," I replied. "Just be careful. We think that a goblin shark urinated on it." I couldn't contain my laughter. I laughed before finishing the phrase. Loveland heard me laughing over the radio. Is that correct? I am curious as to whether or not the urine of the goblin shark has any therapeutic potential. "Gee, I'll leave that to you to decide," I said. "Thank you," she added, before she signed off. I exited my desk and walked away. "Do you want some food?" I inquired of Bernard. A glance at his watch revealed that it was close to midday. We went to the teeny-tiny cafeteria to obtain some food without realizing it would be our final supper before everything went to hell. When I had a few minutes to spare after lunch, I decided to check up on goblin sharks on my employer's tablet. Indeed, the creature we had witnessed had a striking resemblance to a goblin shark. However, there was no mention that goblin sharks have tentacles coming out of their bodies. If we had encountered a new species, it wouldn't have been a significant surprise, but I couldn't help but think about it. There are many species, that the human race understood very little about living in the ocean's depths. Not only have we recently found the advantages of miracle coral, but there were also estimates that the number of species that live in deep water is more than 10 million. Because we had filmed all of our harvesting excursions, we could identify the footage that contained the creature and then transmit it to a group of experts who would determine whether or not it was a species that had not yet been identified for the first time. The entirety of that was well beyond my pay grade. As the day ended, Bernard and I had no more luck, nor miracle coral. Ultimately, it was how most days went because the stuff was uncommon. We decided to stop and asked about Loveland's interest in participating in a virtual reality game in the lounge after finishing our day's work and going to the lab. As we approached the door to the laboratory, which was a thick pane of glass, we looked through it to see Loveland standing with her back to us, her head cocked to the side to examine something that was on her workbench. Because we, the lowly harvesters, were not permitted entry inside the laboratory, I lifted my fist and beat on the door. And yet, Loveland did not make any move. When Bernard suggested that she must be locked up in something, I responded, "Yeah, that's right," while brushing off a negative feeling that had suddenly come to me. Following our departure, we made our way down the hall to the lounge, where we discovered that Vicky, one of the techs, was already present and getting ready to release some steam through virtual reality. The activity we enjoyed the most was mini golf, since it was so peaceful and gave us the impression that we were not confined to a small station located about 1,000 feet below the ocean's surface. After that, we all put on our headsets and started playing the game. When the screaming began, we were on the course's 7th hole. "I don't even know what that is," Bernard remarked, as we all removed our headphones and turned our attention to the door leading to the lounge. "Could that be Lonnie, the assistant lab technician?" Vicky asked, with her green eyes locked on the entranceway. The headset I was wearing was placed on the couch, and I cautiously approached the entrance. It might have been Lonnie, and it sounded like it was coming from the laboratory. However, I peeped my head out of the lounge and gazed to the right, but I could not see the laboratory because the station was practically a giant circle. This was because the hallway was curved rather than straight. What was that? I was taken aback by a voice that came from my left. Raph, the station director, was heading down the corridor when I saw him. "I'm not sure. Let's go check it out." In the direction of the laboratory, the four of us made our way down the hallway, with Raph and I taking the lead and Bernard and Vicky following closely after. When we finally got a good look at the laboratory, we noticed Lonnie lying on the floor, still wearing his lab coat. Raph spoke the words. Oh my goodness. Lonnie's face was a mass of blood and bone, as if his head had been thrown into a giant blender. What in the world happened? Vicky let out a scream. We were plunged into darkness briefly before the emergency lights came on. The lights at the station went out with an electrical thud. When I glanced through the laboratory entrance for Loveland, I found no sign of her, and the illumination was dim. Why would Loveland do this? Raph asked about it. I doubted it instantly. No way, that is not even remotely possible. There is no other explanation. You were all together, and it was not me, Raph remarked. And why else would she turn off the lights? There is no other explanation, I shouted. I'm going to go find her. And then I started sprinting down the hallway. My initial progress was approximately 6 feet when Raph intervened by yelling, "Wait!" Turning my head to look behind me, I noticed all three look down at Lonnie's body. Lonnie's head exploded, splashing white and red fluid all over Raph, Bernard, and Vicky. I was standing far enough away that I only got some on my shoe, but they had it all over them, on their faces, clothes, and hands. It was shaking as if he were being electrocuted. We all stared, dumbfounded. Before I could ask if he was still alive, Lonnie's head caused the explosion. While my 3 co-workers were gasping for air, cursing and wiping the goo off their faces, the recollection of the goblin shark that was thrashing around suddenly came to mind. The body of Lonnie had stopped moving and was now lying quiet once more. But, unlike before, there was now a massive hole in the place where his face had been torn apart. Even though I was desperate to locate Loveland, I turned around and hurried down the corridor. However, I was also concerned about whatever came from Lonnie's head. First, I looked through the control center, but couldn't find any trace of Loveland. On the other hand, I noticed that the control panel for the station lights had been broken with a hatchet, which was still protruding from the panel. While moving around the circular station, I brought the hatchet out of its sheath. As I approached the entrance to the emergency escape pods, I was sure Loveland would be waiting for me inside. I was looking through the glass of the locked door when I noticed she was behind me. I had never seen her like that before. Her appearance changed totally. She attempted to unlock the entrance to one of the pods but needed help when she kept repeatedly inputting the incorrect code. After I clicked a button, the door gradually opened for me. She turned around and the sight of her face caused me to make a loud scream of my throat. The length of her nose had increased by several inches, and her jaw appeared to have been shattered by a second mouth protruding out, the one with rows of needle-sharp teeth. Meanwhile, her eyes had become more extensive and angled out, almost touching her temples. They had changed from ocean blue to a chilly black color. While she was running toward me, I noticed that her fingers were excessively long and wavy, similar to the tentacle protruding from the goblin shark we had seen before. This was the reason why she had been having difficulty entering the code. When she approached the entrance, I jumped out of the path, but as she did so, her fingers, which resembled tentacles, wrapped around my left wrist, and I cried out in pain. On getting hold of the hatchet, I slammed it into her face, which was distorted. She let out a screech that was so loud that it shattered my ears, and her tentacle snapped my left forearm. I screamed out in agony and ripped the blade to her brain, then slammed it back in. A moment later, she fell to the ground, but she still had a hold of my shattered arm, so I also fell to the ground. I was fortunate enough to find myself on top of her. After continuing to slice her with the hatchet a few more times, she stopped moving, and the tentacles became more accessible. My arm was shattered, and I gasped in pain as I looked down at it. I scrambled away and sat against the wall with my back against it. Meanwhile, Loveland's body began to shake all of a sudden. I jumped to my feet and ran away just in time to avoid her head exploding, which would have caused the blood-colored goo to spread all over the place. Walking down the hallway, I occasionally looked over my shoulder, pondering what to do next. Raph, Bernard, and Vicky stood shoulder to shoulder in the corridor, staring at me when I turned my head forward and looked down at them. Despite my efforts to elevate the hatchet, Bernard leapt forward and grabbed my arm, allowing him to easily remove the item from my grasp. Raph intervened and delivered a right hook to me as he did so. As I fell to the ground, the world became black and silent, like the ocean's depths. Upon returning to life, I was completely unaware of the elapsed time. Raph and Bernard held me down as I lay on the room floor containing the escape pod. Vicky was standing over me and looking down. Her eyes were black, and her face was already beginning to deform, much like Raph and Bernard's faces were. Vicky pushed her shirt up with her long fingers, exposing her stomach. It was like a second belly button, but more extensive and prominent than the first one. However, there was something wrong about it. When she began to shake, I thrashed around, attempting to break free. Raph and Bernard held me down with ease. After what seemed like an eternity, Vicky's second belly button, which was located in her stomach, suddenly ejected a milky material all over me. As soon as it was over, she stopped shivering, removed her shirt, and returned to staring at me. It seemed that Raph had become trapped in the middle of yawning as he extended his mouth. I observed the formation of a second set of jaws within his mouth, gradually moving forward. But all of a sudden, it didn't seem as unusual to me. It seemed as if people were supposed to be a combination of the goblin shark, the tentacled creature, and something else. An organism of some kind that took control of animals and used them for its survival. Instantly, Raph and Bernard released me, and I stood up. Using my fingers that had not changed yet, I punched the codes on the escape pods, which enabled Raph, Bernard, and Vicky to enter the pods. I set the pods to climb and release an emergency landing with only a few finger taps. After that, I climbed inside the fourth pod and proceeded. I was hurling toward the ocean's surface when I heard the whoosh of the other pods, which were launching one at a time. After that, my pod launched, and I was hurling toward the surface. During my journey, I reflected on the creature that we had seen since the beginning of the journey. I was aware that this organism had originated from the most profound depths of the ocean and had been gradually ascending the layers for thousands of years. It was as if I had always been aware of this fact. It had been trying to make its way up to where food was more abundant, but the species that hijacked it could not survive in the upper layers of the water since they had evolved to remain in the deep ocean. The difficulty was that survival was difficult at the bottom of the sea, and there was needed to be more. On the other hand, the organism discovered species that appeared to be able to travel freely to and from the deep ocean. This discovery was made only a few years ago. They arrived at the depths and a weird vehicle, and then they vanished again in a short amount of time. Until this point, it had not been able to discover a method by which it might gain access to these animals that appeared to possess intelligence. Have you ever traveled through the sea? What has been your experience? You can share it with us in the comment section below. Are you a lover of scary and intriguing stories? Now don't forget to check out any of our videos displaying on your screen for more captivating stories like this. It's just a click. See you in our next video.